Hello, college football fans. Welcome to episode 198 of College Football Throwdown. I'm your co-host, Alex Schmitz, and today I'm joined, as always, by my dad, Peter Schmitz.
Hello, Husker fans and college football fans.
Yes. For those of you out there who listened to our previous episode, episode 197, you'll know that was our podcast here recorded in late April, discussing everything that's going on with the Nebraska Cornhuskers and our spring game events and spring practice and all that fun stuff. Ended up being a pretty sizable podcast, so we're now recording right afterwards. You know, we still got our beer in hand, and we're going to just go right into some of the national topics that also deserve their own time and attention here.
Sounds like a good idea. Let's go for it.
So we're a father-son duo here to talk about college football by college football fans for college football fans. And we're going to start things off today with what is a bit of past history. It happened over this past month or so, but it did raise quite a stink in the college football world while it was happening, which was Tennessee's starting quarterback, Nico Amaleva, was in negotiations with the Tennessee staff about trying to up his NIL deal, I guess, his contract, because he is the starting quarterback and everything. And apparently he was playing kind of hard to get and demanding a large fee. And the Tennessee staff decided to kind of put their foot down and say no. And so he transferred out of the program. And so, of course, this got a lot of attention. This starting quarterback from a major university entering the portal. I don't think there's been quite a precedent on this scale, at least, so far in the portal era. And ended up getting picked up by UCLA. So they were willing to throw down the bucks to satisfy him. But, similar. This is a little bit similar to something we talked about in the Nebraska podcast about the importance of the culture of the team and how no one's above the team, even if you do have talent. And clearly the Tennessee head coach thought the same and was not kind of willing to cave into his demands. And I believe Tennessee picked up a quarterback from UCLA, ironically. So it's almost like they did a trade of like this quarterback for this quarterback.
Exactly. That's the craziness of this, unregulated, no guardrails era that we find ourselves in. It's just absurd. And no public business, no professional sports organization would ever survive with the arrangement that we currently have. Now, I want to clarify a couple of things, if I can, Alex, about what you just described, because there's some important details that I think our listener, if they haven't heard these details, might influence their perception or belief of this whole scenario. Okay? And the first is that this player, Nico, after the season was over, now keep in mind, Tennessee played in the college football playoff in the first round. They lost. Okay.
Right.
But they were in the playoff. That's significant. He had a very good year. He was clearly the leader of that football team and the guy that was likely to lead them in the future because he's a young player. He's still got multiple years of eligibility left. And they negotiated with him at that time, and he agreed to an NIL deal with them in late December, early January. Okay. So he had agreed to an NIL arrangement. And only after the NIL period or portal period opened and closed did he realize, because of his handlers and his parents and all the other people that are in his ear, that, the going rate for a quarterback with the kind of stats that he had and the number of years of eligibility remaining and all these other factors, the market had shifted. And the market had gone up from the $2.2 million that approximately that he was supposedly already signed up for, that he wanted $4 million. So almost twice. Okay. And this is another example, as we've discussed in previous podcasts about this in this NIL era, where again, these teams are willing to be absolutely desperate for a quarterback. I'm going to use another analogy or allegory for another team. Michigan struggled mightily last year as a defending national champion. What was their biggest issue?
No quarterback.
Quarterback play, right? They could not get a quarterback who could consistently execute. And they tried every quarterback they had on their roster. They tried a bunch of kids, right? Well, a frustrated but wealthy Michigan alum put up $10 million of NIL to fund, not that they used it all. I don't know how much they used. Maybe they're planning on using it. I don't know. But to get themselves and secure themselves a top quarterback. So they did that. And they got a guy to switch from LSU to Michigan to become their future, right? Now, he was from the state of Michigan. So the guy lived in Michigan, but had committed to LSU and then switched after being thrown a bunch of money. Okay.
Right.
So that's what happens is the desperate do stupid, unmitigated disaster type things, right? Because they're so myopically focused on getting this one thing done. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so Nico was the first one to say, okay, now I'm seeing this craziness and I'm seeing this market value dramatically change on me. So I want to renegotiate. Well, you've already signed a contract, bud. Okay. So no. And we've already budgeted, for all the other players, all your teammates. And this is how much money we have. And this is what we can give you. And this is a fair number because it was a fair number in January.
Mm-hmm.
And now this kid, because of the people in his ear, convinces. Well, now, of course, then after the fact, after he did something no one else did, which was he held out. Right? Players had done some different things, but no one had actually done this in the middle of spring practice. He chose not to show up for practice as a protest for not getting his way.
Right.
And the fact that they initially said, we're not going to reopen this discussion. And so when he missed practice, then the coach unilaterally made the decision, from a culture standpoint, this is unacceptable. And yes, you're our guy. I mean, he had been handed the keys to the kingdom, and that coach just took them back from him, said, thank you, but no thanks. And that was the end. Then he had no choice. He had to leave Tennessee. There was no rebuilding that bridge, right? Mm-hmm. So just so you know that. And then, of course, his party, his group of talking heads changed their tune. Oh, it wasn't just about money. It was mostly about he didn't like the offense. And they came up with all these other excuses. Well, his move to UCLA absolutely destroys all that because UCLA's offense last year was a disaster. And they have no proven record of them being a good team putting players into the NFL and quarterback in with this recent coaching structure that they have. And Tennessee does, right? And Tennessee, he was very successful last year with Tennessee's offense. So that holds no water. And yet those are the excuses he said. And I can guarantee you he did not get $4 million from UCLA.
Right.
In fact, I'd be surprised if he got the 2.2 that he was going to get from Tennessee.
Right.
So this was a disaster for Nico.
Right.
The only good news is he's from California, so he's back home in his home state playing possibly in front of more of his family and friends.
Right. Well, and not to mention being the laughing stock in the public eye for, 2 weeks or whatever.
Precisely. And his last name has now been modified to I'm a leaving.
Right. Though this does actually affect Nebraska because we play UCLA in our schedule. So we'll have to see if he performs and boosts their offense.
Oh, I don't question whether he's a good talent or not. I mean, I've watched him play a couple times last year. He's a good talent, but he's not a great talent. See, his stats look really good because he beat up, like a lot of SEC teams, they play a schedule that has a bunch of patsies and then their conference, right? So he put up huge numbers against some patsies, and then in all the big games, he kind of wilted.
Right.
Okay. So he's yet to perform, and now he's going to be performing with a far less talented roster than Tennessee's in a league, the Big Ten, that's going to be equally brutal to him.
Yeah, definitely. And less patsies to play against.
Right, because now he has to play 9 conference games. So I just think all of this is just bad.
Right.
And again, bad advice. A young person given bad advice.
Right. Well, and this once again ties back into the previous podcast, what you quoted from Matt Rule about how the desperate are the ones setting the market value in the portal, like a Michigan, in this case, with their great quarterback need. And it just kind of goes into something I saw a post on the college football Reddit the other day talking about, just how crazy the NIL has gotten. And I kind of agreed with him where it's like, I knew when, the rules changed and, paying players became opened up and stuff. Like, I knew, okay, these players are going to make good money. Like, they'll be making hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe if you're like, a Jalen Hurts, like a really, really good star quarterback, you'll make over $1 million or something like that. But that was kind of the range I was in where it's like, okay, we'll be in maybe tens of thousands for your smaller players, hundreds of thousands for the average, and then maybe over $1 million if you're like the tippity top. But how it's inflated, like you say, with these boosters, willing to throw this money around is so unsustainable in the long run,
Yes.
right? Universities cannot afford to keep paying these numbers, but they do it for the short-term gain, right?
Well, and the thing is, they're doing it not based on performance, not based on a Jalen Hurts who's won a national title and then gets paid money. They're doing it based on potential of players that haven't done anything, right? Either high school kids or college players who enter the portal because they're unhappy with their current situation, often because they're the second teamer. They're the second stringer because they have some other great player ahead of them, right? So those types of things. And then there's the specific, if you're a very good left tackle, okay, then your value gets just absolutely magnified by the fact that you're in a position, the left tackle position, so critical to most offenses that people will pay stupid money for it. Okay, and how did the professional leagues deal with this? They created rookie salary caps and rookie slotting, right? In the NBA, they slot you, man. This is what you're going to get paid, and it controls the growth of those compensations so that they're reasonable and manageable within the framework of the leagues. And even with that, I can tell you right now, the NBA is in real trouble. And the only one that currently isn't, but could be very quickly, is the NFL. But the NBA has now set up an unsustainable structure, even with all of these rules in place. So NCAA, it's going to collapse upon itself. A bunch of schools it's going to get so crazy and so much money that a bunch of schools, I think, are going to raise their hands and say, we're out, we're done. And they're just going to step away. And they're going to say, we're going to get back to our mission of being an academic institution, and we're going to have collegiate athletics, but at some other level. And we're going to step away from this NCAA craziness, and we're going to do NAIA level. Or we're going to create a new organization that doesn't do this pay anymore. And if players want to go to that league that pays, or those schools that pay, you can go ahead. And then it'll end up being a very small number of schools that remain in this frenzied pay thing. That's what's going to happen.
Right. Yeah. Well, and like you were just saying, about recruiting on potential and everything, every indication is that this quarterback that Michigan's got is an absolute stud, the best in his class, and could be a superstar for them. But say either he comes in and he underperforms, he's not as good as everybody thought, or maybe he is good, but then he plays against Nebraska and we get back there and sack him good, and now he's injured for the rest of the season, and you just spent millions on this kid that now, didn't have the physicality to play in the Big Ten, as a true freshman or whatever. Now what are you going to do?
Right. Exactly. Well, there are so many scenarios, right, where this just absolutely the juice isn't worth the squeeze, as they say, right? Where a bunch of these people are going to pay for this potential. You never want to be in a situation, all salesmen get paid on their performance, right?
Right.
But then once they perform within an industry, at a certain level, then other people are aware of that performance, and they can then get hired away with increased pay based on their potential to be equally as good or better in whatever this new sales role is that they're going to take. Right.
Right.
That's the way the free market works. I totally get that, but there are guardrails in that. examples would be that in that salesman analogy, if that salesman goes to that next job and he's not able to blow the doors off of the sales numbers and do really well like he was at the previous company, guess what? His compensation will plummet if he doesn't just flat out get fired.
Right.
Okay. So at the end of the day, there is a check and balance within those types of systems that assures that performance still has to happen eventually, or that person is done. Right. And it's never absurd, because you have third and fourth parties involved, the agents. Now you've got, it's not even an agent in a school, like, which would be the NFL scenario. You now have parents, and then a fourth entity, which is boosters, who are going to get tired of writing checks and not getting results. So that's going to start putting even more pressure on athletic departments to fire coaches, make changes, do this, do that. I mean, all of it's going to just unravel.
Right.
And with all that said, I've got a question before might be a transition to the next thing, which is the House settlement. What are the chances that a House settlement that's organized by a committee of people and then approved or disapproved by a singular judge who's female, that she is going to, and they are going to come up with a set of rules and conclusions and structures that have any chance of solving these undefined, no guardrail problems that we have, when it took decades and decades of the development and growth of the NFL and the NBA and Major League Baseball for them to arrive in the various programs and setups that they have. And they would all agree that even their systems don't work, and that there's still areas of it that are the Wild West.
Right. Well, I think the fact that the judge is female is irrelevant, but to me, it's more about just getting some guardrails in place. We know it's not, going to fix all the problems, but to at least have a starting point to build from, I think, and to calm the chaos in the Wild West, like you say, it would be great at this point. And then we can, build from there and see if the NCAA can actually survive,
Well, you're assuming that these guardrails are actually going to work, and that there's not going to be people that are going to figure out loopholes around them. And not to get in an argument with you, Alex, but for you to say having a female judge who's evaluating over an issue that is primarily a collegiate football issue is absolutely 100% relevant. Okay, it's because she made a statement in the last week. We've been sitting here blowing around in the wind with no guidance, no perception, waiting for this person's ruling. And then literally after our coach, Nebraska being a team with 150 players, who's already been working for months on figuring out how he's going to get his roster size down to 105, she now comes out and says, I'm not going to approve this if there's not a grandfather clause.
We're transitioning into that topic.
Yes.
Which is about this, NCAA antitrust settlement. When the article I read, it did mention that apparently she had suggested in the past, basically, that grandfathering in basically the current players, that basically the current players get to stay on, without the roster limits, for the duration of their college careers, and that the roster limit would only go into effect then for people that are new freshmen coming into this year's class. Essentially, she had suggested that previously, and I guess the NCAA and other parties kind of ignored it or poo-pooed it. And now, just recently here, she has made that more explicit. Like, no, I'm happy with the other parts of this deal, but this is a sticking point.
They didn't ignore her saying that. That was not clear. And all kinds of teams were making all kinds of decisions affecting a bunch of current student athletes and their futures at their institutions. No clear thing. And you're the judge who's overseeing this, and you aren't cluing in that that's kind of an important piece of data. To me, that's her not being aware of what's going on around her, not understanding the implications of the concept of what she's dealing with, because she doesn't have the firsthand knowledge of the sports world, and specifically college football, which is the driver of this thing. It's the elephant, and she didn't understand that was a huge thing. Okay, and then she comes out with these statements here at the 11th hour. To me, that's the height of ineptitude on her part. If she didn't know, and if she did know and she withheld it, that's even worse.
I mean, I would say that, the fact that all these, universities and athletic departments are making all these decisions and plans and moving money around and stuff based off of a proposed settlement, a proposed judicial settlement that's still in the works, that's all, smoke and mirrors, but, nothing's firm and written down and signed, legally or whatever, but we're just assuming all this stuff is going to go through. The whole situation is a bit messy, in my opinion.
Well, exactly. That is very easily addressed. Okay. If you knew the sport and understood how collegiate athletics functioned and how it operated, and the fact that it's always operating about the next year, the future, right? That if you were the person who was responsible for that from a judicial standpoint, you would have made clear those expectations, and you would have set a timeline that said this year's going to be about putting it in place. Will actually the actual year of implementation is a year later, so you guys have a whole calendar year of budgeting and everything to deal with it after the decision is made. So none of this stuff is going to go into effect for a year after we finalize it. That's the way it should have been. Okay, and the fact that those people involved didn't do that, that is, in my opinion, a huge failure. And if you're the judge that's wielding the biggest stick, you have to be the leader in that. And if you knew what the hell you were doing and what you were involved in, you would have done that.
Here's the counterpoint, though, and I'm not going to pretend to be a legal expert because I'm not, never went to law school or anything.
I'm not either.
But I do listen to a lot of legal podcasts and stuff. So,
yes,
whatever that's worth. The whole reason that the NCAA is doing this settlement at all is because if they went to court, they would lose, right? The players who sued them are in a strong position. And the whole point of this being brought up is because it's to give relief to the players who have been wronged, by missing out on this money or whatever. And once again, I saw in this article, a statement from some, college player basically saying like, oh, I'm glad that this rule is being insisted upon about, changing keeping the roster limits grandfathered in place for those of us who are still in college, because I'm being cut because of the roster limit change, but now I'll be able to be kept on, so when you've got these big class action lawsuits, and you're representing all these clients, and, they're coming to you with, hey, to make my job as a lawyer, representing all these athletes is to make my clients happy. And this part of the settlement isn't up to snuff. So I'm going to complain about that to the judge, and it's up to her legal discretion, to evaluate how that balances out, and what the legalities of the whole situation are, which obviously we don't know anything about. So we can't speak to that.
Exactly.
I would agree that, perhaps there could have been better communication or better timeline given, but saying, oh, this won't be implemented for a year, I don't think that would fly, because the other side would say, well, that's going to screw this client and that client and all these athletes of mine, so it's got to be implemented now.
You would have implemented the financial side of it, but you would have known that the eligibility side and the roster side had to be grandfathered in. It's so obvious that that's what you would have to do if you were intending to develop a solution that was equitable to all the parties involved, so that the negative impacts would be minimized. And if that's your job as a judge, then you need to pursue that. That's my only point. And I think that the fact that this seems to have come out of left field, where all these legal experts for the NCAA and for the people on the class action side, that they were all marching to this assumption that these roster limits were hard and fast. And the NCAA has already changed things like in volleyball. I mean, there were the limit before was 12 scholarships, Alex. Now the roster size is 18. So magically, every team in volleyball can increase the number of players by 6 on scholarship.
Right.
Because roster and scholarship are basically one and the same now. There is no limit to the amount of scholarships you can give up to the roster limit. And all that stuff could have been implemented. All you would have to say was that if the roster is bigger than the roster limit right now, they're going to have the opportunity to bring it within that limit as eligibilities expire. Simple.
Right.
That's not a hard conversation to have. And the fact that this is all coming at the last minute, it to me points to the people in charge, and specifically the one who has to make the judgment, which is the judge. So there's my opinion. That's why it's so strong in negative towards that person, because I think it's so fundamental.
All right. I went back to an article about it. So to be specific, it says Wilkin, the judge, had suggested during a hearing for settlement approval earlier this month, meaning April, that the NCAA should consider delaying its new roster size rules to grandfather in current athletes. So
yeah, in April.
Right. So it had been brought up earlier, but like you say, a few weeks earlier, not like months earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. When they first started talking about this housing settlement, which goes back practically a year, right? I mean, we started hearing about this a while ago, maybe 9 months, but I think it's a year. I don't know the exact timeline. I mean, and people, as soon as they got the first word of the outline of this thing and the roster limits, that's all they talked about. That was talked about for months. What were they going to be? How many were they going to be? You know, what was Nebraska going to do? And it occupied our university for this entire time. And now at the last minute in April, this comes out when they're supposed to have an agreement signed, sealed, and delivered by like late June or July. I mean, I'm sorry, that's unacceptable.
Right. But once again, from a judicial perspective, it's like, oh yeah, we're aiming for this, June, July deadline. Oh, that's what all the news reports have said. But the law is slow, and if it needs more time, it needs more time.
Then somebody should have been sounding the alarm way before now.
Right.
So I know we're beating the dead horse here, but I thought this was a good dialogue to have on our podcast, Alex, to kind of show some of the what I consider fundamental issues that are at play. And the two things I would say is I think we got the wrong people making the decision, and the second is that if they think they're going to come up with a series of rules and guidelines that are going to actually help university sports or collegiate athletics magically in the first stroke of the pen with this extremely complicated thing that is so much more complicated than any individual NFL, NBA, professional league is, they're crazy. This does not have a good fix. The right fix is to say the NCAA was wrong. It's no longer the organization. We have to create a new organization so we can eliminate some of the legal precedents, and we're going to create a new organization with a whole new set of bylaws, a whole new constitution, and we're going to establish that constitution, and we're going to agree to participate under those rules and start this whole thing over again. And because the NCAA has too much precedence, too much legal history with it that they can't win in court. Well, then we got to create a new organization and start a new set of rules.
Let's focus on the kind of present now. Okay, let's say that because it seems to be the case. Okay, so the roster limit does need to be grandfathered in for the current athletes, and it'll be the case for the freshmen coming in this year's class or whatever. How does that then change, like the planned 105 roster limit, right, for Nebraska football? If that's no longer the case for the older players who are there, right, and some of those older players who maybe we, would have liked to hang on to, we now can. Do we just hold on to them now, believing that, the rule is going to change and that the NCAA is going to grandfather in this roster limit situation?
Okay. If we go with the assumption that the roster grandfathering is going to happen, then, like a few of these players that just went into the portal today, and I bet you we'll end up hearing about a few more by tomorrow. It might even be 6 or 7 more. I think every player that is in that situation where they're their coaches have told them you're above the 105 number and you don't have a spot, but we'll hold it. We might be able to keep you. To protect themselves, they needed to get in the portal.
Right.
Then they have both choices. They need to be in the portal so they can come back out of the portal and stay at their university, or they're already in the portal before the time frame ends, right? Does that make sense?
Right. The spring portal was only open for 10 days or whatever.
So they needed to get in there. So they have the choice to go to another school and to entertain offers from other people who might be interested. Okay. So that makes sense to me that you would want to do that. So I think all of our players who are in that never land of not likely part of the 105, but might still be able to stay with the team, but could also have opportunities at lesser schools or even another Power 4 school. All of those guys should be in the portal right now.
Right.
Now, well, because all this stuff came to the last second, I mean, these kids were put in a rock and a hard place. They had to act quickly. And to me, that's horrible and wrong and unnecessary. And so that's what's got me so fired up about it, is that I mean, they have the wrong people running this whole thing. And it just causes me to have no confidence that any of this shit that's going to come out of here is going to be worth a darn. I think the vast majority of it is likely going to be head scratchers, and you're going to be like, who the hell came up with this idea? I don't think it's going to give us the guardrails we need.
Well, we'll see. Obviously, when, in terms of off-season podcasts, if that big ruling does come down in June, we'll definitely do a podcast at that time to go over the specifics.
Right.
And see how it changes the landscape.
Right. Well, and like say, I think they're going to end up softening the blow, and they're going to kick the can down the road. I think ultimately a lot of these decisions, the $20.5 million number is going to be kind of fixed, because I think that's already been, they've really walked down that line. And that's another number that came out of this whole house settlement. So we're believing that to be gospel. That's same as the roster limits.
Yeah.
That number could change. We have been operating with way too many of these guide rails already assumed that if it ends up not being that, all hell breaks loose.
Yep. There was also some updates on the NCAA Rules Committee. They met, as they typically do this time of year, to go over proposals that have been voted on and made their way to their desks. One that we had talked about on our previous podcast was basically fake injuries by players. So that rule, as previously drafted and discussed on our podcast, has basically been approved. So the rule is that if a player goes down after the ball has been spotted, the team of that player will be charged a timeout. And if they're out of timeouts, they'll get a 5-yard penalty. So I think it's as we discussed on the previous podcast, I think it's a good change, to kind of cut down on some of those egregious, what seems to be, you never know for sure, but what seems to be fake injuries, especially by defenses when a offense is trying to run a hurry up offense. Sometimes that will happen just to give the defense a breather and to cut down on the pace. So if you do it after that team has already rushed up to the line and, the ref has set the ball and all that, then you would be penalized. Now, I think the majority of these cases happen before the ball is set, right? Because if it's a typical play, if they're not running a hurry up, then often there's a bit of a gap before that happens. So I don't think it will completely eliminate the problem, but it's a step in the right direction, at least.
Well, I'm going to take a wait and see on it, because honestly, I think that there's going to be a bunch of examples of legitimate injuries, okay, that either are not observed by the referees at the time that the play is over and the ball gets placed or whatever, and they then judge it to be after the ball is placed because they didn't see it beforehand. And then the team doesn't have timeouts left and they get a 5-yard penalty, or they have timeouts left and they lose a very critical timeout, which is enormously valuable. And then at the end of the game, they don't have that timeout, and that causes them to lose, because if they had a timeout, they'd have been able to call a timeout and bring the field goal kicker. I mean, I could just see all kinds of scenarios where that does not end equitably or fairly for a team who's perceived to have done that. So the interpretation of that sounds to me like their language is not very precise and leaves a lot to judgment and interpretation. And I think that's a very unhealthy thing.
Right. Well, what I think it will encourage, coaches will tell players, hey, if you're feeling dinged up after a play or whatever,
stay down.
and but if you're not sure, you think, oh, I can get up, I can hobble this off. But if you're not sure, if you're in a gray zone, just like you say, just stay down. Right after the play, we'll come out, we'll take a look at you. But don't try to tough through it necessarily, because that could, like you say, if it is a legitimate injury, that could lead to a serious consequence.
Right. Except that if you've watched any collegiate football, heck, if you've played high school football, the number of times that I was dinged or that I see players who are dinged who do walk it off and then stay in is large.
Right.
So if all of a sudden all of those players are then being instructed to stay down, the number of injury timeouts, because when that happens, they have to blow the whistles, stop play, the people have to come, and from a medical professional standpoint, they can't just say, oh, I know you were probably able to walk that off, let's get off the field. No, they have to go through whatever the protocol is to find out, where's it hurting, let me test it, do this, do that. And that's going to dramatically increase the time.
Right.
Anything that encourages people where there's this gray area, I think it blows up in your face.
Yep.
How's that for being, contrarian tonight?
Yeah, well, hey, it makes for good podcasting.
There you go.
I was just thinking, I don't know if the statistic exists, but I'd be curious to see, like in 2024, how many, of like the players who did go down injured, how many happened after the ball was set, because if it's like, 10% out of, the 100% of cases, then it's like, okay, because that's what I think it is, honestly. I think it is a small percentage of the total.
Yes. Well, I agree with you. I think most of the injuries are legitimate. It's only rarely that this happens, but it's at very specific times or intervals or circumstances or whatever. And when it's coached or when it's something where the coaches were guiding it a little bit to produce an advantage for their team, I think it's obvious. And to me, when a group of referees begins to see it and are suspicious, they let the first one go. Maybe even the second one go. But then when there's a preponderance of evidence that says, okay, I've now seen this, and I think this is the third time where this fake injury thing or borderline fake injury has happened, now I'm going to nail them and then make the punishment severe. But the idea of somehow changing the way players have to behave in terms of walking off injuries or walking off dings and coaching them to just stay down, for example, if that's what it leads to, I think that's a horrible reaction to what is otherwise a fairly small problem.
Right. And then there were a few other rule changes that are worth noting. Apparently in the current existing overtime rules, after basically in every overtime period, each team got one timeout. Which became a bit of a problem once you got to a third overtime, because at the third overtime, it goes from your traditional overtime into the type where they set up on like it's a extra point and the teams just go back and forth, just doing one play.
Yep. Then they go to the other side of the field and one play.
Exactly. And so having each team having one timeout for each overtime period after that could get excessive, because then the team, sees how the offense lines up. They call a timeout on defense. They change their scheme. And so it could drag that out to be longer when the whole point of the overtime rule changes to make overtime not take as long. So they've now updated it. So after the third overtime, each team only has one timeout for however long the game lasts from there. So you have to be more strategic with that one timeout that you use.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
I would agree. Yeah, that makes sense. And then I don't have really the specifics here, but apparently there were already rules in place about pre-snap distractions, such as, defensive players making signals or,
yes,
calling things out to try to confuse the offense, and the offense doing similar things to the defense. Apparently, just some of the definitions for those have been broadened to try to combat this problem.
Right. Because now that's a real problem.
Right.
That's a real problem because when you have teams that have, massive scouting preparation and you start picking up on tendencies of a quarterback or just of an offensive coordinator and how they communicate, and you're able to duplicate that communication technique and confuse them, that's unfair, right? But you're chasing your tail a little bit with all of these rules. At the end of the day, if you're having problems with your communication, then go back to the old school of running a guy out there with the play.
Right.
Like they used to do in the old days. Wide receivers would stand there next to the offensive coordinator and he'd give them the play and the wide receiver would go in and give it to the quarterback. And the next play, another wide receiver would replace that guy. And so there was a substitution, right, that sent in the play. And then at some point, people started doing signals. And of course, where that went.
Hell yes.
So figure out a simpler way. And if it means some of these offenses are forced to slow down because of those defensive strategies, because I think this just kind of spirals. I think it just, they'll just keep finding ways to confuse and, they're just, I don't know, squeezing a balloon.
Right.
And, interestingly, on that other rule that you talked about with the overtime, what I'm inclined to believe is I feel like the NFL has finally gravitated to an overtime that kind of works for them. I think we ought to be pretty close to the NFL.
Hold on. Because if it's the NFL overtime I'm thinking about, I strongly disagree. So my understanding of the NFL overtime is that if the team who wins the coin toss, I believe they start from like a normal position, like they do a normal kickoff and all that. So you have to go
right.
the whole length of the field. But if you score a touchdown on that first possession, it's game over. The other team has no ability to respond.
Correct. If you score a touchdown.
Right. I hate that. I disagree.
If you kick a field goal, however, the other team gets a chance.
Right. But to me, that seems silly. So, you've played tough this entire game. Clearly, it's been a close game, and then the offense comes out, and yes, they have to go to the whole field, but say there's just one single, missed coverage right on a pass, and some dude gets wide open, scores a touchdown, and now that other team that's played great the whole time has no opportunity to respond. I far prefer the college system that gives both teams the opportunity to respond.
Okay, we'll have to agree to disagree on this to keep the podcast in line.
Well, why do you like that?
Well, because we're actually still playing real football. We're following all the rules. We've got first downs, we've got second downs, third downs, and fourth downs, and we're creating incentive for the team with the football, especially the team that gets the ball first, to be aggressive, knowing that if they settle for a field goal, they're giving the other team a chance, where if they go for it on that fourth down and get it and then eventually march down and score, they're winning the football game in extra time while playing the game of football. Nothing about the collegiate overtime is playing real football.
I'll concede that to you on the after the third overtime or a single play.
No, even the first overtime.
But it's starting with a short field, and you're right. It gives you the fallback plan of we have a pretty easy field goal to kick, but we've seen, plays where you go backwards, on those plays, and then you miss the field goal and things of that nature. And it still incentivizes you to score a touchdown, because if you could score a touchdown, you put pressure on them to score the touchdown, that they can't just go the easy route and kick a field goal. So personally, I was okay with the old system where we just did that back and forth until somebody won. It would sometimes, in rare occasions, lead to these really long games, but I think that's exciting when it happens occasionally.
Well, but they were thinking of player safety, because at the end of a game, you've already played 60 minutes of high intensity football. Overtime, these two teams are already exhausted. But here's the thing. Statistically, if I kick off to you, okay, then your chances of taking that drive all the way down for a touchdown are a fairly small percentage, say 20% or less, 18, 16. If I give you the ball at the 25-yard line, you only have to move the ball 25 yards to score. The probability that you're going to score on that drive is dramatically improved. And then you add in the fact that you've already played 60 minutes of football, so both teams are more physically exhausted. And what is a defense doing? A defense, by its general nature, is reacting to an offense, which gives the offense an advantage when both teams are tired. So the probability of lots of scoring then when you keep putting the offense at an advantage, to me, that's not football. I would rather us continue to play the sport by all the rules that we have, with just one caveat, that to avoid a team from taking a kickoff and then having, speaking of just one play, having one or two plays that get you into field goal range. With today's field goal kickers and all the amenities of primarily indoor stadiums that are perfectly weather coordinated with no wind, the field goal kickers win those games. Then all the effort of those two teams that have played this great game to a stalemate, it all goes out the window and it ends up being about that kicker, that foot. And I don't want that. I want them to play football. So I'm okay with them doing that. Once both teams have had one opportunity to score and they haven't, or they both kicked field goals, then it's all, it's free for all, right? Like, it's whoever wins. Whoever scores the next time, they win, no matter what. So I think that's way closer to playing real football.
Last point on this, because we do need to move on. Your point about, being a 20% chance, that you score a touchdown from a normal position. You would have to adjust those statistics, because in the NFL as well, right? You've played 4 quarters, you're tired. So,
yep.
I think your odds generally of scoring against the defense, right? Because like you say, the defense has to react. One mistake by the defense could lead to a big offensive play. So I think it still is a higher probability of you scoring a touchdown in the overtime than it is normally.
Oh, it absolutely is, but it's not nearly as dramatic.
True. And point 2, I don't mind that the importance of the kicker is elevated in overtime, because I think, back to Tom Osborne's classic phrase about how it's not special teams, but it's kicking game, and it is a third of your team. It's, 33% as important as everything else. That kind of elevates the kicking game, right? Like, you want to have a great field goal kicker, for the general play, but also to have that in your back pocket in an overtime situation where that your kicker is going to make it, 98% of the time within that distance, versus a team that doesn't. I think that's part of, the narrow margins in a close game that make the difference between this team and that team.
Yep. Except for 2 things. And that means that the coin flip is the thing that gets elevated. Who gets that ball first? If all I need to do is gain enough yards to get.
The coin flip is more elevated in the NFL method, because whoever wins the coin flip, if they just score a touchdown first, they win. Game's over.
But they have to score a touchdown, not a field goal. There's a huge difference.
True, but it's at the 25-yard line. So, if we're talking about, the power 4 level teams, most of those teams have a good enough field goal kicker who can score it, from 25 yards, right? So even if I go first,
not Nebraska in the last in the last 10 years, Nebraska has struggled mightily at kicking a 25, which would be a 35-yard field goal.
Right.
I would like to see what the stats are in Nebraska's 35-yard field goals.
Right. But we have been, on the bottom end of the trend line, right? We're not the average there. So the point is that the average teams on that level generally do make those. So even if I have the better kicker and I kick a field goal, on my first possession, the other team will often kick that field goal too, right? I mean, it's quite rare that they don't, which is why we get the longer overtimes in college, which, once again, I understand from a player safety perspective, from a length of game perspective, from a TV perspective, why we all want that to be shorter. But just purely as a fan, I like the long epic games. I like it when it goes to, 5 overtimes, and it's exciting.
Then play football and not not this sideshow thing that they do.
All right.
That's
All
my
right.
argument.
I didn't know we were going there today, but there's an overtime debate for you fans out there.
There you go.
Let us know what you guys think. Where do you fall in this debate?
Exactly.
All right. So just two last points here. We want to make a quick note. Lee Corso, a longtime football commentator, obviously with ESPN, has had a very storied career there. He has announced that he will be retiring this year, so there'll be one last college game day at the start of the season with him in attendance. Nice farewell for him, and then he'll be retiring. I know we've kind of talked in the past about how he maybe should have retired a while ago because he's definitely been diminishing. Nothing that's his fault, of course. It's just age, but he's definitely not as sharp as he used to be, but he's brought a lot of great moments, over the course of his years with ESPN. Obviously, his tradition of putting on the headgear of the team he chooses is a classic. So any commentary on Lee?
Yeah, I mean, I used to look forward, in the innocent origins of college game day, loved him, loved it, loved that because, at that time he was a shtick. He was kind of a goofy coach. Okay. Even when he was a head coach, he did crazy stuff. So this was not out of character. He didn't create this persona. It was genuine, right? It was authentically Lee. And so that was fun and stuff. But he became a caricature of his own self as time went on. So I lost my fondness and interest in his particular approach as time went on. And maybe that's me becoming a grumpy old man. But I think it's also it also reflected the gradual change of the leadership and the direction of that college game day program and how they felt they needed to go, apparently, to make it successful. And he played along because it paid him well and he was good at it. So, and I will miss him for my memories of him, in the, 70s and 80s, whenever it was that started. I can't even remember now when the ESPN really got going on football. But that part I will be fond of. What he has been for the last 10 to 12 years, like we've said before, long overdue. He should have retired years ago.
Right. All righty. And then last thing we wanted to talk about is just a little bit on the NFL, which we're a college football podcast. We usually don't talk much about the NFL, but obviously the draft involves, the recent college football players. And it's just recently wrapped up here at the end of April. And the big story has, of course, been Shedeur Sanders, Colorado's star quarterback, who a lot of people were predicting would go in the first round, even in the top 5 picks for the draft. And then as things played out, he didn't get picked in the first round, didn't get picked in the second, and it went all the way to the 5th round before he was eventually picked up by the Cleveland Browns. Which obviously surprised a lot of people. And it seems to be a combination of him being a good quarterback for sure, with a lot of talents, a lot of physicality, but not, a great quarterback, like a man. I saw a lot of comparisons between him and the Mannings. He's not like a Manning level elite talent, that maybe he thought he was. And that kind of showed in some of his attitude that he was displaying, at the combine or in interviews, just kind of his cocky, brash attitude that has kind of been a signature of his time at Colorado. His jersey was retired by Colorado along with Travis Hunter here just recently as well. So now he has some egg on his face, and the positive I take out of it is that it's hopefully a message to some of these other young guns in the college game, like Nico Imaleva that we just talked about earlier. Just showing that personality, and teamwork and being a good person and all that sort of classic stuff does still matter, even in this crazy NIL world that we're in. And even if your dad is Deion Sanders and you have all this sway and everything, if people think you're going to be a liability or a pain to work with, they'll pass on you, even if you've got talent. So that's my spiel.
Right. I would totally agree with everything you said, and just emphasize that, and it goes much deeper than that. I mean, when you're talking about picking a quarterback, especially high in a draft, then that guy, you're evaluating him as the image of your franchise, the guy that's going to have to be leader. He's going to have to be a leader in a locker room full of old men, full of professionals. Guys that have been around. All right. So does he have the cockiness, but also the humility to make that work? Does he have what makes a good leader? And the fact that he has some physical tools that look good, but then you also have data points of him behaving in ways that are absolutely not reflective of good leadership, then as a franchise, it's much easier for you to decide, I'm going to take a pass on this particular quarterback and I'll wait for some other opportunities. And that's what teams did. And a lot of times, once that starts to roll, then other teams who weren't really looking at him because they didn't think he was going to be available, they didn't invest any time in him at all. And they're thinking, wow, if that team, which we know was genuinely interested in drafting him, passed on him, we're going to skip. We're going to pass too, because we don't know any better. So it really is only the 3 or 4 that pursued him aggressively. Those are the only ones that were likely to. So it wasn't 32 teams passing on him every round. It was really 4 or 5.
Right.
And those teams kept passing on him. And after it happened a couple of times, then the team's interest might still have been there, but they're like, hey, now I think we can get this guy at a bargain. And ironically, he ended up going to Cleveland, which was one of the teams that was talking with him for quite a while. So they were one of those teams that was genuinely interested. And but they took him as their second quarterback in the draft.
Right.
So they have 3 longtime professionals on their roster. I shouldn't say long time. One that's in like his 3rd or 4th year, and then 2 guys that have been around even longer, who've played and started for NFL franchises, but none of them are superstars. One of them is injured and may never be the same. And then they drafted 2 quarterbacks. So now they're going to let those 2 guys, Dylan Gabriel from Oregon.
Right.
So those 2 are going to fight it out. And probably one of them stays and the other one probably they put him up on the trade block.
Right. Yeah. And Dylan Gabriel was, I believe, drafted in like the 2nd round, quite a bit before
Correct.
Sanders. So yeah, he's going to have to go and fight for his job in a pretty busy quarterback room.
And he's going to have to be clearly better than Dylan Gabriel, not a little bit. If they're about the same, if their total package after observation is the same, you go with Dylan, because you're going to have probably $10 to $20 million more committed to Dylan than you are Shedeur.
Right. And not to mention, if you get the vibe from his time on the team that isn't maturing or,
right.
this or that, then why not stick with the guy that you think has better leadership qualities?
Right. And his dad has ruffled enough feathers in locker rooms during his time as a professional that I'm sure that didn't help with that kind of history. That didn't help his son. Right. And even during the lead up to the draft, Dion was making comments about teams that shouldn't be wasting their time on Shedeur. He was so confident that Shedeur was going to go with one of these teams that they were talking with, that he's like, these other organizations that I know I think aren't very good, don't waste your time, because he ain't going to you. I mean, so he was very arrogant about, like, I can control where my son goes.
Right. Yep. So, just a little reminder that karma does exist in this world, which made me smile.
Exactly. It made me smile too. And all the people who brought it up and made it a racist thing or tried to suggest that it was somehow racist are clueless.
Yes. Because of all the other black athletes who were drafted just fine.
Exactly.
So, yep. That's a nice little capstone to this discussion on the national side of college football. It's ended up being a pretty sizable episode all on its own. So we hope that you enjoy this double feature of Husker and national college football news. As we mentioned, we'll keep our eye out for upcoming news, when this House settlement thing finally does get approved, we'll definitely do a podcast at that time. We'll be doing more podcasts leading up to the fall as we get closer to the season. So yeah. And of course, the playoff as well. They had another meeting here in April, didn't say anything of note, but if they do decide something eventually, we will obviously talk about it.
Right. Well, and we got our 200th episode coming up here soon, so we'll have something special for the listeners for that.
Definitely. All right. So we hope you out there enjoyed listening to this episode. You can email us at huskerpete13@gmail.com. You can find us if you search for us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you search for College Football Throwdown, you can leave us a rating or review there. Like we mentioned, please leave a comment on your thoughts on the great overtime debate that we had on this episode. So thank you out there for listening, and thank you, Dad, for joining me for this episode. And until next time, go Big Red.
Go Big Red.